I'd like to talk about economic decision-making as distinguished from political decision-making. And I'd like to start off with a definition of an economy. An economy is not just a system for producing goods and services and distributing them, because the Garden of Eden was not an economy, since there was no scarcity. So economics is the study of the use of scarce resources, which have alternative uses. So that rationing is inherent in the circumstances. Competition is inherent in the circumstances. There are people, particularly among intellectuals, who think that competition is one of those things we can choose to have or not have, when in fact the only choice we have is how shall the competition be carried out. The rationing is inherent whether it's under capitalism, socialism, feudalism, or any other kind of method. So scarcity is the first lesson of economics. Now, the first lesson of politics is to forget the first lesson of economics.
All right, so the next one here, Democrats demand a more aggressive Ukraine policy. And this article is from Kyle Anzalone over at the Libertarian Institute. And now that President Biden has signed off on the delivery of F-16 fighter jets to Ukraine, Democrats in Congress are asking for more. Several members of the Democrat Party in Congress are urging the White House to provide Kiev with significantly more military support. One representative wants the Biden administration to place non-combatant observers on the ground in Ukraine. So this is an idea that I've seen some think tankers discuss, and this idea of putting what they're calling non-combatant observers, but U.S. personnel, which I assume would be military personnel, on the ground to go watch the battles in Ukraine. That just sounds a lot like military advisors, like what got us started in Vietnam. We know that there are U.S. troops, some special operations forces, and there's also weapons inspectors, just a few dozen. But this would certainly, add to the U.S. involvement in the war. And this is something that Representative Jason Crow has called for. He's a Democrat from Colorado. So he said that they could learn through direct observation and communication with Ukraine's forces. He did not specify, what type of personnel would be sent, whether they would be Defense Department or CIA or what exactly. But of course, it would just add to the risk of, the U.S. getting more involved in this war. And Senator Jack Reed, Democrat from Rhode Island, he's the chair of the Senate Armed Services Committee. He's backing a plan that would send the ATACMS missiles to Ukraine, and those rockets have a range of nearly 200 miles. And other Democrats support that as well, including Richard Blumenthal, Sheldon Whitehouse. So the Biden administration so far has rejected requests to send those ATACMS missiles to Ukraine. So Rep. Adam Smith, a Democrat from Washington, he's the ranking member of the House Armed Services Committee. He's calling for the White House to authorize sending cluster bombs to Ukraine, which are very controversial. As I went over yesterday, Lindsay Graham was calling for it, and a lot of Republicans have been calling for the cluster munitions to be sent over there because the U.S. apparently has a lot, and they want Ukraine to use them against Russia. And of course, that would put a lot of civilians in harm's way because they drop all those little bomblets that wind up hurting people way after the fact that civilians can come across them. And that's why the cluster bombs are banned by over 100 countries. Russia has used them in Ukraine, but Ukraine has also used them in the war. And Ukraine was using them in the Donbass back in, all the way back to 2014 in civilian populated areas. So they've been used in the conflict on both sides. And Kyle mentions as well, Jerry Nadler, the Democrat from New York, who said that he would not care if, Ukraine used F-16s to target Russian territory. So this is the attitude with these Democrats. I mean, they just want more, and more. And I haven't seen any sign of dissent. China declines meeting with the U.S. Defense Secretary. So the U.S. said on Monday that China declined an offer for a meeting between Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin and Chinese Defense Minister Li Shangfu, who is under U.S. sanctions. So the U.S. proposed for the two military leaders to meet on the sidelines of the Shangri-La dialogue that will be held in Singapore this week. But Beijing has called for the U.S. to lift the sanctions on Li in order for him to meet with Austin. So Li was sanctioned by the U.S. in 2018 when he was the head of China's Equipment Development Department and oversaw the purchase of Russian military equipment. These sanctions were imposed using the 2017 Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act, and they used this law to sanction Turkey for purchasing Russian S-400 missiles, which obviously angered Turkey. And I mean, just the fact that the U.S. sanctions Chinese officials for buying Russian military equipment, I mean, what is it, how do they think they have the right?
It's popular to call politics the art of the possible. I call it the art of the plausible, because what you're advocating doesn't have to be possible. The Clinton health care program, for example, is Democratic Senator Patrick Moynihan referred to the statistics and the estimates of the cost of this program as fantasy. But there's no reason why you cannot enact fantasy into law. There are many laws which show fantasy has been enacted. Let me give you a concrete example of what an economy involves, because an economy involves trade-offs. Politics involves solutions, real or imaginary. Some years ago, there was a tragic airplane crash in which a baby was killed by being torn from its mother's arms. In Washington, the answer was quite clear. We must have laws that say that babies cannot be held in mothers' arms in airplanes. They must have their own separate seat where they're strapped in. Fortunately or unfortunately, a couple of economists got hold of this, and they figured out what would be the probable result of such a law. First of all, it means that every couple that's traveling with a baby would have to buy 3 seats instead of 2. And therefore, they would have 50% higher costs of transportation. Now, since to ordinary people in the real world, as distinguished from Washington, money matters. And therefore, some of those people would not fly. Some would take alternative transportation on the ground, almost all of which has a higher fatality rate than airplanes. And so they estimated that in the course of a decade, you would save 1 baby's life, and you would lose the lives of 60 other people, as well as $72 million. So the whole perspective of trade-offs is typically lacking in political decision-making. People ask such questions as, in politics, is nuclear power safe? And the answer is no, because if nuclear power were safe, it would be the only safe thing on the face of the earth. The only question is, compared to what? Compared to hydroelectric dams? Compared to doing without electricity?
But you know what? The most critical thing in the world right now is, are we going to have a budget and are we going to have a default? Which I think is a joke, because they default all the time. Major defaults and little defaults and constant defaults. But you know for sure it's not crucial because the Congress was gone for 3 days.
Yeah.
You know, if they thought it was important. Friday, I don't think they did much. Saturday and Sunday and Monday, they weren't in session, so they weren't that worried about it. But they got to put a lot of fear into the people. You know, this is very, very serious business. So anyway, they were in, and this was in the midst of something else going on, and the thing that I thought was a big issue, but somebody could make fun of it and say, hey, no big issue, they do this all the time. And it was this headline that caught my attention. Ukraine strikes Moscow with 8 drones, Russia says. My guess is Russia's probably telling the truth, because at least they were bragging. Probably they were able to shot them all down.
Yeah.
But it was Ukraine. What's no business of ours? That's 6,000-7,000 miles from here. Ukrainians can do whatever they want to have to defend their country.
Yeah.
But I don't think any benefit from it. I think it's all a disaster. And one of these days, you know, this was getting more risky all the time.
Yeah.
But it might have to take a little bit more. What if they didn't work so well and they did hit Putin? You know? That would be you know, a declaration of war. In a way, though, in my mind, I call this a declaration of war. It's subtle, it's hidden, but when you provide all the weapons, enthusiasm, and all the money, and then I don't believe for a minute that they would do this without the United States permission. I can't conceive of that. Maybe it could happen. We give them our money and say go to it. Yeah. But that would be hard for me to believe. I mean, I know they're irresponsible, but I think they're going to give the permission for the Iranians to go ahead and do this.
Yeah. Well, there's an interesting timeline that we see, because Lindsay Graham, and we've shown this clip before in the past, we don't have the clip right now, but in the past we've shown a clip of him in 2016, I think it was, in Ukraine saying, this is the year of your offense, you're going to go after Russia. We also know that he's called for someone to kill Putin several times. Can you imagine if a foreign leader, if a foreign representative said that about the U.S.? So here he was, Graham was in Kiev over the weekend. He was meeting with Zelensky. He was giving a talk, and we'll talk about that in a second. And then a couple of days later today, you see these drones attacking in Moscow. I wonder if there's a coincidence. But Graham's visit to Kiev itself caused a huge controversy, and one of them is because of this clip that was released while he was in Kiev talking to Zelensky. Let's go ahead and cue that clip. It's very short, so you have to pay attention. It's 11 seconds. Let's full screen it, and then hear what he has to say.
Free or die.
Free or die.
Now you're free.
Yes.
And we will be.
And the Russians are dying. It's the best money we've ever spent.
Thank you so much.
That was.
So that clip, Dr. Paul, looks very incendiary. You look at that and you say, this is even much for Graham. For him to say Russians are dying and it's the best money we've ever spent is very, very dangerous. But the fact is even more interesting than this, because as much as I hesitate to defend Graham, he did not say it that way. In fact, put on this next clip from Reuters. This is interesting. Reuters has to admit this. Initial extracts of the conversation released by Zelensky's office had not made clear that the two remarks were made in different parts. So President Zelensky of Ukraine's office took two separate parts of the conversation of Graham and spliced them together to make it sound like Graham was saying killing Russians is the best money we spend, which is really, really dangerous language. So our own ally in Kiev is doing something that make the Russians more likely to want to strike and attack the United States. I don't know about you, Dr. Paul, but that doesn't seem like a very good friend.
But you don't you don't see somebody in the administrations going after Kiev for allowing this to happen and for this discrepancy to occur. But anyway, it's a mess. All these things we look at in detail, do this, do that, and what if. We'd be out of work because we wouldn't be there.
Yeah.
We couldn't talk about Ukraine, but that's not the way it is. And I guess the debate over foreign policy is going to last until the military-industrial complex collapses, which is a possibility. That's how great nations always disappear. It's through spreading their wings too far, going too far from home base, and they run out of money. And those things are vulnerable to us. And so I don't as disappointing as it may seem, how they seem to be getting away with it, it always ends badly for those people who go too far. But the thing that you can't get overly optimistic about it, because it takes a long time. I think behind the scenes, there's a lot of stuff they can pass out. If you vote for this is what we get you, and that's the part that is pretty nauseating on how it works. But it's going to pass. Most likely, but my attitude is very cynical, because what difference does it make? Well, it calms things down for a day or two. It says we're having a coalition, a strong coalition for $886 billion to pursue the war in Ukraine. But that's not a positive for me. That's a negative. And bringing a coalition together because they were able to extenuate this, and like Gates tried to point out, the numbers really don't add up when you do the correct add. The deficit is definitely going to continue to go up, even if you had 6 months or a year reprieve. It's built into the system. There's been no significant philosophic changes. There's still a warfare state, there's still a welfare state, and there's still deficit financing, and there's a lot of rhetoric that says they're against it. But I can remember a long time ago they talked about the same way. I remember Barry Goldwater talking about why the debt shouldn't continue, could be troublesome. Well, it's troublesome now. And this is something that will not change gradually. As I've always said, it will change because it cannot be maintained. You can't have wealth produced out of a printing press forever. You can deceive the people. You can fool the people into telling them there's value in your currency, but the currency eventually goes to pot. It does go to pot. It goes down in value, and that's the tax, and that's what's happening now. This idea that inflation is over and the economy is booming again, there are some positive signs, but I'll tell you what, they haven't changed policy. The monetary system is the same, and it's been steadily eroded, especially since 1971, and there's no resemblance to what the founders intended for us to have that would restrain the growth of tyranny over a republic. Homeschooling is key to preserving liberty. The most recent release from the federally funded Nations Report Card shows that 40% of 8th graders lack even a basic understanding of U.S. history, while only 14% are proficient or advanced in history. This score from 2022 showing so many students lack basic understanding is bad. It also indicates a continuation of a decline that started in 2018, the last time the score was previously reported. This report should frighten everyone who wants to restore a limited constitutional government and a true free market economy. Students who graduate high school without basic knowledge of how the government is supposed to work and why the drafters of the Constitution designed it the way they did, as well as the history of the United States, are more likely to fall for the lies of authoritarian demagogues who promise economic and personal security in exchange for the people's liberty. Even scarier is the fact that many government schools have replaced history and civics with critical race theory, transgender ideology, and other forms of cultural Marxism. Contrary to claims of its defenders, opponents of critical race theory do not object to teaching students the truth about America's racial history. Instead, critics object to teaching students that the free market is irredeemably racist and thus must be replaced by rule of the woke. Similarly, critics of promoting transgender ideology in schools are not motivated by a desire to punish adults who decide that they wish to identify as a different gender. Instead, the motivation is a desire to protect children from being exposed to these and similar topics at an inappropriate age. There are also legitimate concerns about allowing children to have life-altering gender reassignment medical treatments. How is it rational to tell a 13-year-old he cannot choose to have a beer, but he can choose to alter his gender? And how is it rational or fair to allow boys to play on girls' sports team simply because the boys have switched pronouns? The good news in all this madness is that it is encouraging more parents to look into alternatives to government schools, such as homeschooling. I have long believed that future leaders of the liberty movement will come from the ranks of homeschoolers. This is a reason why I have started my own homeschool curriculum. My homeschool curriculum provides students with a well-rounded education that includes rigorous programs in history, mathematics, and the physical and natural sciences. The curriculum also provides instruction in personal finance. Students can develop superior communication skills via intensive writing and public speaking courses. Another feature of my curriculum is that it provides students the opportunity to create and run their own businesses. The government and history sections of the curriculum emphasizes free market economics, libertarian political theory, and the history of liberty. However, unlike government schools, my curriculum never puts ideological indoctrination ahead of education. Interactive forums ensure students are engaged in their education and that they have the opportunity to interact with their peers outside of a formal setting. I encourage all parents looking at alternatives to government schools, alternatives that provide children with a well-rounded education that introduces them to the history and ideas of liberty without sacrificing education for indoctrination. Go to ronpaulcurriculum.com for more information about my homeschooling program. Thanks for listening.
There's a story which I hope is apocryphal of an economist who was on the street, met a friend who said, "How are you? How's your wife?" To which the economist replied, "Compared to what?" So looking at nuclear power in this way, it is far safer than any alternative method of producing electricity. Someone calculated how many lives are lost for every so many billion kilowatt hours of electricity, because human lives are among the price paid for generating electricity. And having calculated this, they asked how many lives would be lost generating the amount of electricity that would have been generated by 3 Mile Island during the time that it was shut down. And the answer was 52 lives. No lives were lost at 3 Mile Island, even during the, quote, disaster, unquote. 2 people were killed on the highway trying to get away from 3 Mile Island. Someone has calculated the risk to your life of various kinds of activities. Living within 5 miles of a nuclear power plant for half a century represents the same risk to your life as driving 10 miles on the interstate highway, or spending half an hour in a coal mine, or 6 minutes in a canoe. And I think of all the environmentalists in their canoes worrying about nuclear power plants.
So a Ukrainian official this week was pushing for a stronger commitment from NATO during the annual GlobeSec Forum in Bratislava, Slovakia. So this is Olha Stefanishina. She is Ukraine's deputy prime minister for European integration, and she was saying that Ukraine wants NATO to give Kiev a roadmap toward membership at the upcoming summit in Vilnius, Lithuania this July. So this is going to be a pretty big summit, and there's been a lot of talk of this. This is some pretty strong words here from a Ukrainian official about this issue. So Stefanishina said, quote, Vilnius should give a clear signal that politically Ukraine is invited to join NATO. We need a unified commitment of all member states, end quote. So Ukraine was first promised that it would eventually become a NATO member back in 2008. And they promised that despite warnings from the U.S. ambassador to Russia at the time, who was William Burns, who is now the head of the CIA. At the time, he said in a cable to Condoleezza Rice that Ukrainian entry into the alliance, into the NATO alliance, was the brightest of all red lines for Moscow. But Kiev was still given the promise. But they have not been given, a timeline or a real roadmap on when they can actually join the alliance. And there is an understanding among NATO members that Ukraine cannot join the alliance while it's actively engaged in a war with Russia. At the Vilnius summit, the alliance is expected to announce new forms of support with a focus on making Ukraine's military more interoperable with NATO. And we've also seen these reports that they're thinking about an Israel model, which, would not include an Article 5 style, mutual defense guarantee, but it, would mean lots of military aid. But these commitments are not good enough for Kiev. They want more of a concrete, promise when it comes to their future membership. So Stefanishina, she said that being stuck in the same place that Ukraine is now in respect to NATO membership would be totally unacceptable. And some European officials who attended this summit, this GlobeSec summit, seemed to agree with what she had to say. Estonia's defense minister said, quote, what we have to push in Vilnius is that there has to be a clear understanding of what are the next steps for Ukraine, end quote. So the Czech Republic's foreign minister also expressed support for giving Ukraine some sort of guarantee like this, saying that his wish list for the upcoming NATO summit includes Sweden joining the alliance, which is something the U.S. is really pushing Turkey to agree to now that the elections are over and Erdogan won. But this Czech official also wants Ukraine to be formally invited to join the alliance. But he did acknowledge that it's a complicated matter. And according to recent media reports, the U.S. is hesitant to give Ukraine any kind of promise like this, as are the Western European countries, Germany and France. But NATO foreign ministers are actually meeting in Oslo on Wednesday and Thursday this week. And during those meetings, they are expected to debate this issue. So this is something that they want to work out, what they're going to do at this summit in Vilnius in July beforehand. So that's going to be a big part of the conversation when they meet this week. And whatever the NATO countries decide, basically, we know that they're going to announce some sort of new future support for Ukraine. And, all this is going to do is prolong the war, as we know that one of Russia's main motivations for invading Ukraine was its alignment with NATO. And Russia's primary demand during those short-lived negotiations that took place in the early days of the conflict, their primary demand was Ukrainian neutrality. And recently they've said that, that it's neutrality. It's all about Ukraine's neutrality. So big promises from NATO is not going to help bring this war to an end. All right. So the next one here, a drone swarm hits Moscow in the largest attack on the city of the war. So this was really the big news on Tuesday. Russian authorities said that 8 Ukrainian drones targeted civilian areas of Moscow, marking the largest attack on the capital city since Russia launched its invasion of Ukraine last year. Moscow's mayor said that the drones only caused insignificant damage to residential buildings and that 2 people were treated for minor injuries, but did not need hospitalization. The Russian Defense Ministry said that 5 of the drones were shot down and 3 were downed using electronic warfare capabilities. Russian President Vladimir Putin said that the drone attack was an attempt by Ukraine to intimidate Russian civilians. The attack came as Russia had stepped up its bombardment of Ukraine. Ukrainian covert attacks have really increased inside Russia in recent months. We've seen a lot of these. Kiev does not officially take credit for the operations, but Ukrainian officials have strongly hinted at their involvement. And this is Mikhailo Podolyak. He is an aide to Zelensky. He said, quote, of course, we are pleased to watch and predict an increase in the number of attacks. But of course, we have nothing directly to do with this, end quote. So it was interesting. Last week, the New York Times reported that U.S. officials believe, either one of Ukraine's military or intelligence services was behind the drone attack that targeted the Kremlin in early May and other covert attacks inside Russia. The report said that this is basically the U.S. view, apparently, is that they don't think Zelensky is signing off on each covert action. They suspect that, he gave kind of a general okay to this covert campaign. But we also do know from some of those Discord leaks that Zelensky was proposing major attacks inside Russia.
There's a whole literature about safety. I think the crucial book was Unsafe at Any Speed by Ralph Nader about the Corvair. And the argument was that because the Corvair was a rear-engine car, it had certain safety problems peculiar to that kind of car, and that these problems were disregarded when the car was produced. And of course, he has all the particular individuals who died as a result of these things. And I took a lot of interest in this since I was driving a Corvair at the time. And it's certainly true that there are different handling characteristics to a rear-engine car, which makes it more prone to certain kinds of accidents. But what Nader apparently didn't have time to get around to was that it's less prone to other kinds of accidents. And therefore, no matter where you put the engine, if you put the engine in the front, if you put it on the top or the bottom or either side, it would have some kinds of accidents that it was more likely to have and other kinds that it's less likely to have. And the studies that have been done indicate the Corvair was no more dangerous on net balance than any other car of that era.
No one in America can match when it comes to the Bill of Rights and the Constitution. Oh, two things that we don't have anymore, but he knows a lot about them. It's Judge Andrew Napolitano, a real paisano, and a man that cares about the spirit of America, what America was founded upon, and how it's been lost. And Judge, thanks for being here.
Oh, it's a pleasure, Gerald. You say we don't have them anymore, and we say it with a little bit of humor. Unfortunately, there's more truth than humor. The Bill of Rights has become a bill of privileges that the government, like a water spigot, thinks it can turn on in good times and turn off in bad times, even though the Bill of Rights restrains the government from interfering with our personal natural rights that don't come from the government, that the government has no moral authority to interfere with, but it does every day.
It's so sad what's happened to this country and how it's gone down. But again, as you point out in your article that's coming out tomorrow, Government by Experts, and it's about, the Supreme Court and regarding an environmental issue. But you go on here, to say how the people that destroyed this country were two little egomaniacs. One Abraham Lincoln, which everybody loves because they don't know any of the details of what he's done. And you go on to mention that because of the Civil War that he started, which had nothing to do with slavery. Correct. The only slavery that happened was we became slaves of the federal government. And how many people he killed, some 750,000, destroyed the South, the beautiful buildings and the culture that was created when the nation was founded. And Woodrow Wilson, another murderous little piece of crap that gave us the World War I. You point out the bankster bandits, the Federal Reserve System, federal income tax, and robbing us of our constitutional rights by passing, what was that act that he passed?
The Espionage Act.
Yeah, espionage.
Right. I mean, the Espionage Act, the government is used to punish speech. Norman Thomas, the socialist leader, who was an undergraduate at Princeton with Woodrow Wilson. Now, this is obviously long before he's a professor and president there, so they knew each other. Spent 2.5 years in a federal prison for speaking against World War I under the Espionage Act. The Department of Justice persuaded a federal judge and jury that he was harming the nation's national security by arguing we had no business getting in a fight between the last vestiges of European royalty over the borders between their kingdoms. But Wilson, of course, wanted us involved and punished the speech of those who opposed him. Now, he's president now of the United States. He had been the president of Princeton. He sent a federal agent to arrest Princeton students. What was their crime? They were reading the Declaration of Independence out loud in front of a draft office, and they were arrested for interfering with the draft. And when people questioned the president, so what about the First Amendment? He said, well, the First Amendment says Congress shall make no law infringing upon the freedom of speech. I'm not the Congress. It doesn't pertain to me. Such a statement in a law school today would result in an F, because the First Amendment stops all government from interfering with the freedom of speech. Little historical footnote. What was the name of the federal agent sent to Trenton by Wilson to arrest these Princeton students? John Edgar Hoover.
Ah, that little slimy piece of crap.
Yep. And the rest, of course, is history.
George Washington. And he said, quote, "It is our true policy to steer clear of permanent alliance with any portion of the foreign world. Overgrown military establishments, which under any form of government are inauspicious to liberty, and which are to be regarded as particularly hostile to Republican liberty," meaning the Republic of America. And all that's lost now.
Oh, NATO, this is one thing that I agreed, one of several that I agreed very much with Trump on. We had no business being involved in NATO. The whole concept, the whole principle is antithetical to America staying out of foreign wars. I mean, this NATO thing is absurd. There's about to be a coup in Belarus, in Belarus, someplace that most Americans probably never heard of. President of Belarus is a good friend of Vladimir Putin. The military is about to conduct a coup there. The Polish military is going to enter the country in order to further the coup, and the Russian military is going to enter the country to oppose the coup. Russians against Poles under the NATO treaty. We'd be obliged to come in and fight the Russians in support of the Poles. This is absurd, but this is what the NATO treaty requires. So if Joe Biden's looking for an excuse for troops on the ground, he's about to have it.
Liberal, willing to respect or accept behavior or opinions different from one's own, open to new ideas. That's the definition. They're not open to new ideas. They don't respect other opinions that are different than theirs. Liberal, relating to or denoting a political and social philosophy that promotes individual rights. Why, how dare you say individual rights? You should only believe what I tell you to believe. And that goes back to your article that's coming out tomorrow about what they're doing to us and how the Supreme Court on one issue has gone in the right direction. Could you tell us more about that?
Correct. You know, the EPA, the Environmental Protection Administration, says it can regulate mud puddles.
Yeah.
And it uses as its basis for that authority a phrase, the navigable waters of the United States. And Justice Alito, and a unanimous Supreme Court said, there's nothing navigable about a mud puddle. The EPA's experts said, oh, wait a minute. The mud puddle releases water into the earth, and it's connected by the water table to this stream and to that river and to that ocean, and therefore it's all connected. And the Supreme Court said this is a violation of property rights. Unanimous opinion, a violation of property rights. There are thousands of people in this country who own real estate that they pay real estate taxes on. They can't build on it and they can't use it because of this EPA regulation, which the Supreme Court has now just thrown out. So I was shocked that it was a unanimous opinion. I was ecstatic that it was a unanimous opinion upholding private property rights over an administrative agency created by Woodrow Wilson, an administrative agency expanding its own authority. Didn't get the authority from Congress. It just rewrote its own rules, and it interpreted those rules, and it enforced those rules. This went before the Supreme Court not too long ago, and they ruled the other way. This Supreme Court unanimously, once and for all, said, you guys can't expand your own authority. The real issue will come into play is when Congress writes that authority down specifically. I'm not worried about that happening now, but it could if the Democrats controlled both houses of Congress. Although there's not much difference between the Democrats and the Republicans if you want to segue into debt, because Kevin McCarthy sounds like Nancy Pelosi when it comes to letting Joe Biden borrow all the money he wants.
Yeah, this is ridiculous. You know, when you look at the real debt level, by the way, it's more like 280 trillion.
Correct. That's the unfunded liabilities, the commitments the federal government has made to human beings for which there is no money to back it up. But what's particularly despicable about this McCarthy negotiated deal is it's not a number. There's no number. Okay, Joe, you can borrow another $2 trillion. It's open-ended.
Yep.
It's open-ended. They can borrow as much as the government, as much as the public will lend them. Not just the public. The Chinese government is lending them money too. China and its entities own 1/3 of our debt. So at this rate, by 2030, 7 years from now, the defense budget will be $1 trillion. The interest on the debt will be $1 trillion. Social Security will be $1 trillion. That will leave $1 trillion more in income tax revenue for everything else in the government. Stated differently, it will build in the government borrowing about 6 to 7 trillion a year. Back to Woodrow Wilson. He borrowed 30 billion with a B to fight World War I. We are still paying interest on that debt. What's the interest we've paid so far? 15 billion. You imagine that? Only the federal government would pay a 50% interest rate. Have we retired the principal? Absolutely not. We've rolled it over, but we haven't retired it. We're still paying debt on it. That's the way the government operates. These clowns from both political parties, pro-war, pro-national security state, pro-welfare state, pro-big government. Oh yeah, there's a Republican wing and a Democrat wing, but their cultural, their mindset is the same. And their mindset is take from the haves, give to the have-nots. Even give to those who have, give to big corporations as well. Military-industrial complex.
Well, you talk about the military-industrial complex. Well, look at the deal that they're making with this debt ceiling. They're increasing the military spending. No, they're not going to cut back on the defense spending. No, we're going to increase it. I think I think in 2025 it's going to almost go. It's almost going to be $900 billion just for the military industrial complex without putting the so-called intelligence into it.
Senator Graham is opposed to this because there's not enough of an increase for the military.
Yeah. And you know how they keep quoting this clown like he's a somebody when he's just a little nobody, and they have them everywhere.
He is everywhere. This week he is everywhere, yes.
Yeah. You know, I remember when Fox used to come up here to Kingston. You know, they had the trucks and they used to do remember those days?
Oh yeah, the huge antenna would come out of the top of the truck.
Yeah. And they're doing live, right?
Yeah.
And all of a sudden we have to take a break. Senator Lindsay Graham is on right now and cutting me off. So you hear this clown when you can hear him BS all day long, any way you want. That the perfect ticket for the 2024 race to the White House would be RFK Jr. for president and Judge Andrew Napolitano for vice president. It's a winning ticket. It's getting people from across the spectrum. And most importantly, it's getting the people that are activists for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These aren't the nobodies that just follow the dumbbells. These are activists that'll keep pushing this forward.
I'd like to talk a little bit about the whole political mode of decision-making in terms of the patterns that you see in it. There's one pattern in which you generate political support by creating a, quote, crisis, unquote. Now, since all human situations have some negative features to them, nothing is easier than to find something to complain of and to call it a crisis. A crisis does not mean that what you're talking about is any worse than anything else that human beings do. It does not even mean that it's getting worse than it was in the past. In a remarkable number of cases that I've looked at, the thing that is called a crisis has in fact been getting better for years prior to the policies.
A lot of these guys are saying we need to eliminate the debt ceiling so that we don't have a crisis. But what these Democrats completely overlook is the impact of the deficits on American families. Somehow they think the deficits have no impact. It's just the limit on the deficits that has an impact. No. Who do the Democrats think are on the hook to repay all these deficits? It's the American families that they're pretending to care about. Interest rates are going to be much higher in the future because of these deficits. Inflation is going to be much higher in the future because of these deficits. If you really care about the American family, then stop burdening them with the responsibility to repay all these deficits, either through taxes or inflation. If you care about the American family, you will not raise the debt ceiling, because that means you're saying, American families, we're not going to burden you with any more debt. The debt that you have right now is it. We're going to stop here and we're going to try to reduce the burden of debt. No, what the Democrats say is we want to get rid of the debt ceiling so there's no limit to how much debt we can pile on the back of the American family and obligate them to repay either through taxation or inflation. But again, it's not just the Democrats I want to criticize for blaming the problem on the ceiling. I want to criticize the Republicans for claiming they've done something about it, for claiming they've actually won a hard fought victory on behalf of the taxpayer, on behalf of the American public, when they've sold out the American public and the taxpayer. This deal is a complete farce. Everything from the name of the deal to what's inside it is a fraud on the American public. In fact, I would not vote to reelect anybody who voted for this, including any Republican who voted for this. They should not be sent back to office. What is the point? You might as well send a Democrat there. I think the only ones worthy of reelection are the ones who opposed it, because those are the only ones who might make a difference in the future. And, if this is all we can get, if you've got these Republicans talking about how this is this great accomplishment and they've accomplished nothing, well, clearly they're never going to do anything. And that doesn't mean that we're not going to have a crisis. We're going to have a crisis, but not because we didn't raise the debt ceiling, but because we did, because the crisis that's coming is the debt crisis. That is the problem, and it's going to lead to a currency crisis, massive inflation. The American families are going to pay through the nose because of what Congress has been doing, including the most recent bill, this Fiscal Responsibility Act, that is about to pass the House, and then will go on to the Senate and eventually to Biden's desk for signature. And the rising interest rates, rising inflation, all they're thinking about is this AI revolution, which may in fact have some very positive effects on productivity in the long run, but they're not going to be that immediate. And, a lot of people are focusing on the so-called deflationary effects of AI, and that it helps to bring down costs because it increases productivity. And so companies can now produce more goods for lower costs. And all that is true. And that's not deflation. That's just capitalism. That's how capitalism works. It lowers prices. Government raises prices by creating inflation. Now, normally what happens is the government creates more inflation than capitalism creates productivity. And of course, capitalism creates less productivity when you burden it with more government. But what has been happening for the 20th century and now the 21st century is inflation has been the stronger factor than rising productivity. And so we lose the productivity gains and we end up with rising prices. Now, prices would rise even more if we didn't have the increase in productivity. But if we didn't have the inflation, prices would have dropped, and that would have been great. But the reason I think that AI, at least in short run, is going to actually result in more inflation, despite increasing productivity, is when companies lay off workers, because that's where the increased productivity comes from. Because you're eliminating workers and you're replacing them with AI, right? So you don't need as many people. It's not just so each employee, can have more AI. It's to eliminate the employee and to use the AI instead of the employee. That's where you get the significant cost savings, which lead to the greater productivity. But the problem is when people get laid off, the government loses a lot of revenue because all those workers were paying taxes. And the companies were paying taxes on those workers too. There's a big payroll tax in addition to the income tax. And so when these people lose their jobs, the government loses a lot of tax revenue. In addition to that, now the government's got to spend money on unemployment, on food stamps, on all this stuff. So AI in the short run is going to explode the budget deficits of the United States. That's going to lead to even more money printing. And so, yes, businesses will be more productive, but the government's going to produce a whole hell of a lot more money. And I think in the short run, the money printing is going to trump the increased productivity. And so prices are going to go up because the dollar is collapsing. Now, in terms of gold, yes, you're going to see prices coming down. And AI will accelerate the degree to which prices fall in terms of real money, gold, but is going to end up increasing the rate at which they go up in terms of fake money, fiat money, like dollars. And, you know, all these Fed officials, too, I was listening to quite a few of them again over the course of the next week, talking tough on inflation, right? And a lot of these guys and gals are saying that it's going to be hard to get inflation back down to 2%, that it's starting to get entrenched, and, you know, it's harder than they thought, and, you know, so they're going to have to work, you know, harder as far as hiking rates and you know, keeping them higher for longer in order to bring the inflation rate back down. But if that's the case, why didn't they know that? I mean, you know, I was talking on this podcast for years about all the adages about inflation. One in particular, you know, don't let the inflation genie out of the bottle. Why? Because everybody knows, every central banker knows, that if you let that inflation genie out of the bottle, it's hard to put it back in, right? That's where the saying comes from, right? The sayings have their basis in facts, right? Because people experienced it. So now all of a sudden, all these guys who are at the Fed are surprised to learn this. This is obvious, right? This was Central Banker 101. You don't let that inflation genie out of the bottle because it's very hard to put it back in. They're acting like, oh, we didn't know this. Oh, we're surprised that this is not an easy thing to do. I was warning about this when they were so cavalier. Remember how Powell was talking in the past and Bernanke when they were just keeping rates at zero and doing QE in the face of rising inflation numbers? And remember when they said, look, you know, we could be above 2% because, you know, now we're interested in average inflation because we have to make up for the years where it was below 2%. What was I saying back then? I was talking about how dangerous this was. They were playing with fire because they were willing to let the inflation genie out of the bottle. They said they were not worried about inflation getting too high because they said, that's no problem. They said, we know how to deal with that. We have the tools to bring inflation back down, as if it was going to be easy. It was no big deal. So they can be, you know, extra easy, and they can err on the side of too much inflation. And they said this. They said, look, we want to wait until we see the whites of inflation's eyes. They said specifically, we don't want to be preemptive, because the reason they said they didn't want to be preemptive is they said, what if we're wrong? What if we're worried about inflation and we take some action and it turns out we didn't need to do it? Well, you know what I said at the time? That's better than not doing anything when you should have, and then you're behind the curve because you've let the inflation genie out of the bottle. They said they were willing to do that because they said it would be so simple to put it back in. And I was out there in real time saying, what are these guys? You know, are they nuts? Do they not know anything about basic economics or how difficult it would be, especially now? Because the further, you know, the longer you let the inflation out, right, the further behind the curve you are by the time you try to fight it, the more difficult to fight, the higher their interest rates that are going to be required, the more shrinking of the balance sheet that's going to be required. Well, when you lever up the economy so much, when you have this massive level of debt, having to fight inflation when you have even more debt creates even more collateral damage for the economy. So none of this was out of left field. All this should be expected. So none of these people at the Fed have the slightest bit of competence when it comes to inflation or understanding inflation or what needs to be done. Yet nobody calls these guys out.
Now, after you've convinced people there's a crisis, you have your solution. This is sort of a four-stage thing. First comes the crisis, then comes the solution. Typically, the people who advocate this solution will say this will lead to beneficial result A. The critics say this will lead to detrimental result Z. Third stage, they put the policy in, and the result is that it leads to detrimental result Z. The interesting part is the fourth step, where the people who attribute this detrimental result to the policy are accused of being simplistic for ignoring the complexities of the many factors involved. Moreover, the only cure for this new bad situation is more of the same policy. Let me give a couple of examples. First, the war on poverty. Now, the purpose of the war on poverty was not to prove that if you took money from here and put it there would be more money there than there was before. The purpose of the war on poverty was to end dependency on government handouts. That is, you would have an increase in spending and investment, as they say, in these programs, which will then pay off down the road as all the problems that have been forestalled by this wonderful program now begin to subside. You can quote either from Lyndon Johnson or Bill Clinton, depending upon who you prefer to quote. Large literature from both sources. And so, and retraining is one of the great magic words in both administrations. You will retrain people, including people who were never trained in the first place, in order to reduce long-term dependency. So the predictions were made that if you had these programs after some period of years, dependency on the government would decline. And of course, the opposite prediction that dependence on the government would increase. And so the war on poverty was initiated. Dependency increased to, first of all, the situation at the beginning of the crisis. Poverty had been declining in the United States for at least a decade. Dependency on the government to stay out of poverty had been declining for at least a decade prior to the war on poverty. Dependency on government began to increase almost immediately. As of today, there are more people in poverty than there were in 1964, despite literally trillions of dollars spent. And the only cure is more of the same.
All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today, Czech general says that NATO is on course for war with Russia. So this is from Kyle Anzalone, the commander of the Czech Republic's armed forces, said that the North Atlantic Alliance and Russia are on the path to a direct war. The general described the potential war as the worst case scenario, but he emphasized that it remains a distinct possibility. And this is General Karol Reka. He is the chief of the Czech Armed Forces General Staff. He told his country's parliament on Monday about the potential for war. He said, quote, "No one wants it at all, but it is not impossible. It is necessary to stop saying that this is not possible because it is simply possible. It can happen, and it is necessary to prepare for it in the long run. We view war between Russia and the North Atlantic Alliance as the worst case scenario, but it is not impossible. It is possible. Russia is currently on a course toward a conflict with the alliance," end quote. So it's definitely concerning to hear, a top military official in a NATO country say something like that. And Kyle goes on to list a few examples of recent things that have happened that could provoke a direct war between NATO and Russia, including the plan to send F-16s, all these Ukrainian attacks inside Russian territory. And so what this general is saying, I went over this a few weeks ago, that NATO is drawing up war plans for war, drawing up plans for war with Russia for the first time since the end of the Cold War. And those are expected to be, signed and made official at the upcoming summit in Vilnius, Lithuania in July.
Example 2, sex education. Now, the goal of sex education was to prevent teenage pregnancy and venereal disease. And this was, of course, a crisis. Now, for those of us who are tend towards skepticism, if we look back at the actual data, we find that teenage pregnancy was declining for more than a decade prior to the introduction of sex education into the public school systems. By 1968, half of all the public schools in the United States had sex education. During the 1970s, the other half kicked in. Teenage pregnancy during the decade of the 1970s rose by approximately 50%. Teenage gonorrhea tripled between 1956 and 1978, and both those trends are still continuing. And the fourth stage, the cure for all of this, sex education.
Tulsi Gabbard, when she ran in 2020, was bad on a lot of different issues. But what her campaign was about was being good on war. That's what it was about. That was the center of it. That's what differentiated her from everybody else up there. And oh, by the way, all the things she's bad on, everybody else up there was bad on too. So it's still a positive that she was running that year. You know what I mean? It's still it's not, these things aren't binary. It's more of like, what is the purpose of this campaign? What is it doing? And it's great that RFK is running. Look, man, whoever the Libertarian Party candidate is for president, and whoever that candidate should be up on a press conference standing right next to RFK and Vivek, what's his name? Ramaswamy. The three of them should be holding a joint press conference together and saying, this is our list of grievances and our demands of the federal government. We all come at this from completely different perspectives, but we agree on these 5 main things. And you know who did that was Ron Paul did this with God, what do I keep wanting to say? Dennis Kucinich, but no, with Ralph Nader. When they were both running back in 2008, they stood up there and went, listen, I'm the most libertarian person in the country, and he is the most liberal person in the country, but we agree on these 5 things. And it was like, end the war, transparency at the Federal Reserve. What are they actually doing with our money? You know, breaking up these incentivize partnerships between big business and government aid. Like, you know, it's just like 5 really key things that they both agreed on. And debt was actually one of them too. Ralph Nader was like, I'm sure he had some like tax the rich type of vision of it, but he agreed that it was completely wrong to be saddling future generations with debt. But that's what they should be doing. You should be recognizing recognizing what this campaign actually means and how to best galvanize people around it. And then of course, like at the appropriate time, also pushing that, like, no, we're also good on guns and climate change and all these other things. We're not just good on the 3 most important issues. But, you know, the other thing, by the way, is RFK is good on the Federal Reserve too. I mean, I don't think he's Ron Paul, but I think he's like aware of how corrupt the Federal Reserve is. And we talked about that briefly when he was on the show. So anyway, I think that like you can have your binary of like what's good policy and bad policy, but then you can also live in reality and recognize what's better and worse. You know, abolishing the income tax would be great. Reducing it is still better than not.
I also think we're playing for keeps right now with some issues that shouldn't even be on the table. Like whether or not we're allowed free speech and to criticize government policy shouldn't be on the table. And you look at the Biden administration, like their policies kind of rely on not having free speech and not being able to engage on the internet and share actual information. You know, like that shouldn't be on the table. Free speech should not be on the table at all. Also, like policies that government can mandate. You're getting vaccines that are clearly only for corporate profit if you're doing a look back, and domestic terrorism titles, the FBI going after American citizens. You know what I mean? There's just like and the entire green ESG woke agenda. This all relies on a censorship of free speech because otherwise it won't last. And it relies on government enforcing policies that benefit corporate interests. So RFK is at least a little bit of a return of normalcy within the Democratic Party. And at least from what I'm seeing, I think it would probably get us out of the Ukraine war, maybe roll back a little bit of this stupid green agenda and at least allow us to have free speech. Like, you know what I mean? There's just certain things that we're playing for keeps that it shouldn't even be on the table. So if we can get RFK, push him ahead, maybe edge out Biden, you know what I mean? To even just educate the Democrats on, hey, these aren't liberal values. You know what I mean? Yeah,
100%. No, 100%, dude. And I think even short of that, look, one of the things that was so valuable about Ron Paul running for president was that you had this guy who was like the squarest of squares. You know what I mean? Like country doctor from rural Texas, Republican next to his name, the most conservative person. You know what I mean? Like married to the same woman for over 50 years. Wouldn't know what pot smelled like if he smelled it. You know what I mean? Just like this country doctor, conservative Christian who's going, I am hardcore against the wars. Hardcore. So now it lets you know this isn't some leftist hippie position. You don't have to but you know what I'm saying? Like it gives you, as Scott Horton always put it, he goes, if you like your identity, you can keep it. Like, you don't have to abandon your identity. And now am I some type of like America hating hippie if I'm against these wars? No, sir. You're the squariest conservative from Texas. That's who you are. You know what I mean? Like there's something really powerful about that. And it is not a coincidence that Ron Paul got all of that excitement. And then the next guy who won the Republican nomination, Donald Trump, was completely against the wars. It was almost like he gave them permission that you're allowed to have this. And there is something incredibly valuable about a Kennedy, a liberal Democrat, taking all of these positions and letting like the Democratic average voters know that you don't have to be some right winger. You know what I mean? In order to like have these basic, to have these basic views, you don't have to be a right winger to believe in sanity is basically what RFK is saying. And he is polling right now, despite all of the negative coverage, if any coverage from the corporate press, he's polling at like 20%. And the other thing about that is that let's say he loses the primary to Biden, but does really respectably. Like, let's say he gets 20, 25, 30% and loses to Biden. That is still so great because you know that lets all of the powerful people in charge know, shit, even 30% of our own party's base are not going along with this program. That might be the difference between them not implementing the next draconian policy. As we both know, Rob, they do this all the time, where they put their finger in the water to feel how much they can get away with. And then if there's too much pushback, they pull back. And if there's not, they go through with it, you know? And look, man, as bad as things are right now in the country, we would be in such a worse place right now if they had been able to get everything they wanted in. You know, like we would have had a national vaccine passport. That's what the Biden administration was floating out. This is, things can always get a lot worse. And so the RFK, him running for president and running on the things that he's running on is truly heroic. It's truly heroic. And we have no idea how impactful and like monumentally important this can be. So that's all I'm saying is like, you know, the role here for libertarians, I'm not saying you got to vote for the guy or you got to like campaign for him or donate money to him. I would understand why people would do all of those things, but the role at least is to not try to tear him down. It's like, we want him in there challenging Biden. It's obviously so much better. It's either this or there's no primary. Which Marianne Williamson is not putting up a fight against Joe Biden. And, you know, like, you know, she can be counted on to roll over and just endorse him when this whole thing's over anyway. But now, rather than Biden just getting to like not have a primary, if he doesn't now, that looks incredibly weak, right? Because it looks like he can't take this guy on. And this is so much better. Now, rather than there being no primary, Joe Biden is going to get pushed on his policies on these vaccines that, by the way, if he had his way, would have been mandated for all companies with 100 employees or more under this OSHA mandate that he tried to jam through. It was blatantly unconstitutional, as the Supreme Court decided. But he would, if he had his way, that would have been through. Now he's going to be challenged on that. He's going to be challenged on his position on Ukraine. He's going to be challenged on a whole host of really important issues. Come on, this is so much better than if RFK wasn't running. So if anything, our role now should be to boost that signal. Should be to be like, oh, this is great. Be supportive in some way. And then, of course, I'm not saying we shouldn't run our own candidate because we got other issues that we want to talk about too. Because we don't want to just be good on three things. We want to be good on everything. And we want to let people know that there's a reason why we're great on everything. It's because we've got this kind of unified theory of liberty that you know, allows you to understand the correct political positions across the board. But, you know, whatever. Feel however you feel about the guy. As I said at the beginning, credit for what he's good on, and definitely don't knock him on the things he's good on and pretend he's bad on them. I think that's fairly reasonable.
And now we come to a current example, the healthcare situation, or the healthcare crisis, I'm sorry. Now, how do we know that there's a healthcare crisis in the United States? Because the president has told us again and again. The president's wife has told us. The media have told us. What more could you want? Now, one of the statistics they throw around is that the United States spends 14% of the GNP on health care. No reason is given why a higher or lower number would be better. Particularly in a country which is growing older and wealthier at the same time. Germany and Japan are held up as models because there they only spend 9%. I'll get back to Germany and Japan a little later. One of the confusions is the confusion between health insurance and medical care. And the second confusion is between medical care and health. We already have virtually universal medical care in the United States. The poorest soul in these United States who passes out on the streets will get medical care. He may or may not pay the hospital, but he will get medical care. The other thing is confusing medical care with health. There are tremendous differences in longevity within the United States. Mormons in the United States have a life expectancy a decade longer than the average white American. Is this because the Mormons have extraordinary medical care? Or could it have something to do with the fact that they don't drink, they don't take drugs, and they don't go around shooting each other?
The article today that we want to start off with is from Zero Hedge, and it says Mexican TV spots cartel wielding anti-tank rocket launchers in border towns near Texas.
Wow.
It's getting close to our homeland. And, you know, it was only, a couple drug dealers down there that was causing all the trouble. But where do these rocket launchers come from? Do the Mexicans make them down there or just what? But anyway, it sounds like an acceleration, which the American people know about, and they're trying to sort it out. And there's been a shift in attitude because the nonsense that goes on doesn't even recognize the fact that there are still some Americans who still believe that our homeland deserves a little bit of protection action. And in order to make the point, we should be minding our P's and Q's and not invading the homeland of any other country. Yet we're all over the world, so there's a tough making the argument that they ought to leave us alone. But this is, I think we could put this in the category of a little bit of acceleration of what's going on our borders.
Yeah, I think I would call it blowback, really. That's what it is. And let's put the first one up. We know that the cartels pretty much run the show down in Mexico. These aren't your friendly neighborhood drug dealer. These are serious military forces. Well, this is the first time that Mexican television did a segment where they spotted, and we can go to that next picture, because this is the picture they ran. If we can expand that a little bit. This is a person wearing the Gulf Cartel patch on his back. He is operating in Mexico as part of the cartel, and what he's carrying in his right shoulder is apparently a javelin, and some would say a Norwegian anti-tank rocket, both of which, Dr. Paul, have been sent by the tens of thousands to Ukraine. And we have heard evidence that these have been available on the black market, and now it looks like they've made their way not just to the Mexican cartels deep in the heart of Mexico, but literally on the border of Texas. The weapons we sent to Ukraine, we've talked about this over and over, the danger of saturating Ukraine with weapons without any kind of guidelines, without any kind of, like we talked about yesterday, Senator Paul, so we need to have someone keeping an eye on what's going on over there. Instead, we just send it willy-nilly, and now we're seeing literally on the border with Texas, a person carrying an anti-tank missile from Ukraine.
Some people read this thing and they are reassured and they don't worry, but the article we're reading closes with a bit of a cynical comment. It says, but don't worry, because the Biden administration repeatedly states everything is fine on the border.
Everything is fine.
You have to be able to trust your leaders. What kind of a country would you have if the leaders of the country and their policing activity, they tell lies? Then we end up with trouble. And it doesn't need to be said, but I'm a bit cynical about all that, I'll tell you. And I think that's why conditions get worse and worse.
Yeah, it's dangerous. Well, when we put the show together, we try to put the stories in a particular order that makes the point we're trying to make today. And today, the point we're making is the absolute danger of sending these thousands and thousands of weapons overseas. So, juxtaposing our first story, which is javelins on the border, what is the response of the Biden administration? We'll put on that next clip. It's not to say, hey, we need to check this out. No. It's to say, we need to send more weapons to Ukraine. This is from our friend Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. U.S. announces $300 million weapons package for Ukraine. So they're already making their way to the cartels in Mexico, and God knows where else. They're probably up for sale on eBay right now. But forget that. It doesn't matter. We've got to send them $300 million more, including, and if you do that next clip, including all these goodies like additional munitions for Patriot air defense system. Why do they need additional ones? Well, they've already been blown up. AIM-7 missiles, Avenger air defense missiles, Stinger anti-aircraft systems, HIMARS missiles, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So all of these goodies that are finding themselves spread across the globe, increasingly, we're just going to keep sending more and more with no checks and balances.
The bipartisanship is the strongest in military spending.
Well, it's related because, go through the progress. These weapons wind up in Mexico from Ukraine, obviously, anti-tank weapons, threatening commercial air flight. Then you have another $300 million of weapons going to Ukraine, doesn't matter. And then you have the Taliban using our weapons to go ahead and attack Iran. And now the next one is completely unfazed. The U.S. empire goes on with its policy of global domination. Let's look at this next one. And this is from our friend Kyle Anzalone in the Libertarian Institute. NATO holds Arctic war games hours from the Russian border. So they are literally a few miles from the Russian border and holding war games. What if Russia were holding war games where that guy was carrying the missile, right?
Yeah, this is just another item because we were complaining yesterday or the day before about what was going on with the drones. Our drones, our money, our training, our puppets, that do what we tell them to. Sending them into Moscow, what we're trying to do is we're trying to kill Putin. Yeah, that's real good. Smart. And then of course, well, let's have a peace conference. We need to do. Yeah, but don't ever let the Russians in. So it's exasperating, and it's such a shame that that's the way it has to be. But I still think it's worthwhile for the few of us and many few, I would say, that really support what we're trying to talk about, because there's not many people like the cynical argument I always make. The young people 18 to 25 in one country don't get together with the 18 to 25s in another country and say, it sounds like why don't we have an old-fashioned war?
Yeah.
And, that's not the way it works. It's a bunch of bad people that get control of government That's why so many libertarians, approach a position really most government, and some believe all government, are detrimental. And but the government certainly should be very limited. And if you were meticulous and a determined person to follow the Constitution, it would not be perfect, but it would be a heck of a lot better than the authority that goes on today, just granted executive orders and what we have to do for national security, the monetary issues, on and on. The Constitution has so little value, but a lot of people in this country still believe it's worthwhile trying to preserve and renew the confidence that we once had on the rule of law.
Yeah. And here's what it's all about if you do the next one, because this is what we're talking about in Afghanistan. Following Washington's chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan in 2021, the U.S. Army left behind $7.12 billion in military equipment in the country, which immediately fell into the hands of the Taliban. They're using our weapons to fight Iran. It's pretty weird.
And every once in a while, people will call attention to us leaving Vietnam, which was a tragedy, and visually, equal to what we were watching with Afghanistan. But I've heard people, have feeling a need that they had to defend, the leaving of Vietnam. But I didn't see it that way, because one thing that you can measure disaster by is money spent, dollars, how many years, how many people died.
Yeah.
It was horrible what we were doing and looking aggravating, and it's ongoing and never ended in Afghanistan. But what happened in Vietnam is, and the reason we left and under what conditions, you can't say, oh, that one was okay, but it's the one in Afghanistan. I think there's a little bit of partisanship, in the way they describe those two things. They're both bad, and they were both bad for us being involved. But you can't say, well, Afghanistan's much worse than Vietnam. Vietnam's old history. Who cares now?
Yeah, exactly.
Now, the favorite explanation for any problem in Washington is that our society has failed. And so prenatal care is held up as one of the ways of reducing our infant mortality. One of the faster ways of reducing our infant mortality would be to collect the statistics the way they do in the countries we're compared to. Which is to say that when a very underweight baby is born in the United States, all kinds of medical treatment are given to that baby. And when the baby dies in spite of that treatment, that baby becomes part of our infant mortality statistics. In many other countries, no such effort is made to save that baby. And when that baby dies, that is counted as a stillbirth, not as infant mortality. So it's much faster to reduce infant mortality that way, to make ourselves comparable to the people we're being compared with.
Well, here's the problem, as I'm sure you know. In everything you've just described, there are extremely powerful, well-organized interest groups at work that don't want to see $1 removed from what they are accustomed to getting. But then on the other hand, you think, well, okay, it's true we have these interest groups, but we do have the general interest of the American public, which is in keeping the fiscal house in order. The problem with that is that's not an organized interest group, and most Americans don't even understand what the consequences of having a fiscal house in disarray means for them. It doesn't seem to have any direct impact on them, and even if it would in some hypothetical future, that's no match for, Northrop Grumman.
Right. Well, Tom, I'll tell you there. This then gets us to step 2 in this whole discussion, this whole analysis. And step 2 is, if you want to change that difficult equation that every interest group is noisy and squeaky and the general taxpayer is out there trying to make a living and take care of a family, make ends meet, and that's an inherently difficult equation, what you need to do is end the tail on the real donkey here, which is the Federal Reserve. And what I mean by that is, if the Fed did not monetize trillions of the public debt year after year, and especially after 2020, when they went crazy with all these COVID relief and bailout and stimmy plans, which were all funded with debt, if the Fed would stop monetizing the public debt, then the Treasury borrowing these huge magnitudes, it's going to be $2 trillion this year again, and next year and the year after, and as far as the eye can see, that process, if you funded all this debt in the bond pits rather than at the Fed's printing press, interest rates would be pushed sky high, private borrowers would be squeezed out, homeowners that wanted to refund their mortgage or get a new mortgage could be penalized very heavily, And there would be a countervailing message coming into Washington that you can't keep borrowing all this money because you're causing mayhem on Main Street. Now, this isn't a theory. This is what happened. This is what used to happen in the 60s and 70s. This is what we had to deal with all the time that I was in Congress and in the White House. The Fed was not yet monetizing the debt. Therefore, the big borrowing that occurred squeezed out, crowded out so-called private borrowers, drove interest rates much higher, created economic pain, which then ricocheted back into the political process and created at least a reasonable constituency on Capitol Hill, actually in both parties, for some semblance of fiscal restraint. But after Greenspan, after 1987, it was all over except the shouting, because once they went into the monetization business, once they decided they were going to pin interest rates at totally sub-economic levels relative to what the private market would produce, then all of this countervailing pressure that came from crowding out and higher interest rates disappeared, dissipated, and Congress went its merry way, running deficits year after year, bigger and bigger, doing things that we mentioned a moment ago, setting aside the whole annual budget resolution process, not passing appropriations bills, having a debt ceiling crisis every couple of years, and then raising it again and again. All of that can go right back to 1987, Greenspan's arrival at the Fed, and the beginning of this terrible process of monetization by the central bank. In fact, if you pushed me hard, instead of the three things, electoral reform, changing the Fed in a constitutional amendment, I would go for changing the Fed in a heartbeat. Because at the end of the day, if you have a central bank that can print the money, the politicians will never stop spending and borrowing. It's that basic. It's that fundamental.
A couple of years ago, there was a study which showed that prenatal care was not as common among blacks as among whites, and that there was a higher infant mortality rate among blacks. The immediate conclusion was clearly it was one thing was the cause of the other. Again, being sort of battle-hardened about these things, I sent away for the study. And on the very same page where the statistics showed that blacks had higher infant mortality rates and lower prenatal care, it showed that Mexican Americans have even less prenatal care than blacks and lower infant mortality rates than whites. And if one were to thumb a few pages on, one would discover that Americans of Chinese, Japanese, and Filipino ancestry likewise had lower infant mortality rates than whites and less prenatal care. The conclusion I would draw is that there is no connection between prenatal care and infant mortality. But of course, that's not a politically popular conclusion.
Russia's defense ministry said that that Belgorod was shelled on Thursday with Grad multiple launch rocket systems. That is a Soviet-era system. And Moscow said the attackers were supported by tanks and other vehicles, but they did not specify what kind. They didn't say if they were NATO equipment. So U.S. weapons being used on Russian territory, of course, risks a major escalation of the war. Interestingly, the White House is recognizing that. John Kirby, the National Security Council spokesman, he said on Wednesday that President Biden's opposition to signing off on U.S. arms being used on Russia is rooted in his desire to avoid World War III, which is all well and good. But again, it doesn't apply to Crimea, which to Russia, it's just, that's Russian territory. And, there's all these signs that Ukraine is going to use American weapons on Russian territory if they get the chance. So that's what we're risking. At least, the White House is acknowledging that this does risk World War III. And that's what they are risking by pursuing this policy of, giving Ukraine everything it wants, all these weapons. It's risking a direct war between the U.S. and Russia.
There'll be a lot of bureaucrats out of work if we start thinking that way. Getting back to Germany and Japan. In Germany and Japan, people have more doctor's visits for the same disease and shorter visits each time. So one of the ways in which you can bring healthcare costs under control is to have someone go to the doctor 10 times for half as long instead of 5 times for twice as long. That way your statistics will show that you have brought healthcare costs under control. Now, if you're an elderly person who has to stand out on the street in the winter waiting for a bus 10 times instead of 5 times, you may not fully appreciate the good that's being done for you. One of the confusions that runs through the whole health care issue is the difference between controlling costs and controlling prices. Let me look at some of the cost differences that exist. An American doctor pays 14 times as much for malpractice insurance as a doctor in Germany. Nothing that the administration has said is likely to reduce that cost. In fact, given the political support of the Trial Lawyers Association for Bill Clinton, I doubt seriously if that cost will be reduced at all. Controlling prices is something very different. Nothing is easier than to control prices. You issue a law saying it is illegal to charge more than X for product A. They've been doing this not only for centuries, but literally for thousands of years. The Emperor Diocletian, back in the days of the Roman Empire, had price controls. Had exactly the same consequences as price controls under Jimmy Carter. Diocletian's reaction was very similar to Jimmy Carter's. He wondered why people were so greedy. Now, one of the reasons the United States has higher costs is that we have better health care. It was fascinating to watch the president say that we have the best health care in the world. Yes, the best does cost more. You can always pay less and get less. But only by going through the government are you likely to pay more and get less. The United States has the lowest death rate from cancer of the stomach, cervix, and uterus of any country in the world. It has the second lowest death rate for breast cancer and from heart attacks. There are more than twice as many CAT scanners per capita in the United States as in Germany, more than 3 times as many as in Canada. What's fascinating in all the discussion of health care is that the entire supply side is ignored. I don't know where these doctors are going to come from that are going to give us this greatly increased medical care that we're demanding at the government's expense. For example, there are something like 8,000 doctors from Canada alone practicing in the United States, partly as a result of the wonderful Canadian health system that we're being asked to imitate. Correspondingly, there are large numbers of Canadian patients who come to the United States as a result of the wonderful health care in Canada that we're being asked to imitate. I was up in Spokane this spring, and they mentioned how all the people who come down from Canada to be treated. That is, they pay their costs down to the United States in addition to paying for medical care here that they could get free in Canada. One of the people who did this was the Premier of Quebec. I told them in Spokane, just wait a while. After a while, we'll have our health care system, and Americans will be going up to Canada. Over a period of about a dozen years, something like 15,000 doctors came here from India alone. So we have a very large medical contingent in this country from around the world coming here to enjoy the free conditions of the American medical system. Of course, if we make our system just like theirs, many of them will probably decide to go home. What's really lacking in so many areas is a lack of knowledge of the role of prices. There's a notion that prices are just things that people set up arbitrarily on their own. I call it volitional pricing. You decide that you want to charge this. Some prices are high because people are greedy, and other prices are low, presumably because they're not so greedy. When I was teaching at UCLA, I used to tell the people, if that's true, then it must be that proximity to the ocean increases greed, because all the housing prices near the ocean are far higher than they are inland. As you go east into the smog, why the prices go down. And it seemed to me that proves that smog is an antidote to greed. Unfortunately, this theory has not yet been recognized. There is no sense that prices are conveying some underlying reality. In fact, I have a book coming out this fall which is called Is Reality Optional? And unfortunately, among many intellectuals, the answer will be yes. Now, some years ago, when I taught at Brandeis, I traveled from California to Massachusetts and discovered that my auto insurance rates had doubled. And since Los Angeles is not a small village or something, you wonder, why does that happen? Now, at about the same time, many other people were upset because Massachusetts had the highest auto insurance premiums in the country. The political answer was not to say, why are these premiums so high? What fact are they conveying? But it was to control the premiums. In fact, they launched an investigation of the insurance industry, the net result of which was they discovered that insurance companies were losing money in Massachusetts, charging the highest auto insurance premiums in the country. Now, anyone who's ever seen Massachusetts drivers will know that there's no mystery as to why those premiums are so high. The only place where you can regularly see drivers changing lanes in the tunnel during the rush hour is in the Callahan Tunnel in Boston. When I taught at Brandeis, I can recall driving to work on the right-hand side of the street and being surprised to see a tractor-trailer pass me on the right on the shoulder of the road. The only place where I've seen emergency vehicles with their sirens on, having to jam on the brakes because someone did a left turn in front of them, is in Massachusetts. But of course, people didn't want to hear what the prices were telling them, and so the answer was to control the prices themselves. There have been many other areas in which there have been price controls. They have a standard, really stereotypical pattern. One is that you reduce the supply of whatever is being controlled. Not surprising, since people do less when they're paid less. The other is that you reduce the quality of what's being controlled, because higher quality is costlier than lower quality. And when you force the prices down, people then reduce the quality of what they're producing. One of the classic examples is housing. Wherever rent control has been put in, there is a shortage of apartments. In many places, there's a provision in the law that says this is only a temporary measure until the housing shortage is over. And sometimes they define that in terms of some percentage of vacancy and so on. And what they don't understand is that as long as that law is on the books, there will always be a shortage, and there will never be a time to take the law off the books. In Paris, they put a law like this on the books as an emergency measure during World War I. It was still in force when World War II broke out. In Sweden, they put one in the early days of World War II. Decades later, it was still there. Finally, for some reason, it occurred to someone to take off the price controls. Instantly, there was a housing surplus. The housing projects put up by the Swedish government suddenly began to have high vacancy rates, and in fact had to be bailed out because they couldn't fill them. I thought about rent control a few years ago when I visited West Berlin. It was still a difference in those days. And I could see this marvelous new modern city. And I came back and visited some of my relatives in the Bronx. And as I drove into the Bronx and I saw all these hulks of abandoned and boarded up buildings, I thought, suppose someone from Mars had come down here and you said to him, which of these two cities was bombed during World War II? He would pick the Bronx, because Berlin had recovered from the bombing, but the Bronx had not recovered from rent control. One of the other problems of politics is that there must always be problems and solutions. It was once said of a liberal politician, he has more solutions than there are problems. Let me give you an example of how problems can be created statistically and otherwise. One of the Congressional Budget Office came out with some statistics a few years ago showing that the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer or were during the Reagan administration, presumably not in this new enlightened era. Now, again, being skeptical, I sent away for the original statistics. It really produces absolute cynicism when you read enough of these government reports. One of the ways that the poor were getting poorer was that they left out of these statistics more than $150 billion in government transfers. Those weren't counted. And as for the rich, they counted as capital gains things that most people would not think of as capital gains. For example, if you invest $10,000 and you hold the investment while the price level doubles, and then you cash it in. Now, if you get less than $20,000, you have lost money in real terms. Not as far as the government's concerned. Let's suppose you get $15,000 back with the price level doubled. As far as the Congressional Budget Office is concerned, you've made $5,000 in capital gains. And if you want to correct for inflation, you divide the $5,000 by 2, and so you've made $2,500 in capital gains. So you can be one of the rich who's getting richer all the while you're heading toward bankruptcy court. And this produced what I think is one of the fundamental principles of statistics, which is that A always exceeds B if you leave out enough of A and exaggerate B. One of the reasons that the people in the upper income bracket receive such a high percentage of the total national income is that there are more people. That is, if you look at the top 20% of families and income and look at the bottom 20%, you'll discover that there are 28% more people in the top 20% than in the bottom 20%. And since it is people who earn money, this is one of the reasons the others are in the top brackets. There have been a number of studies done. Well, there's a more fundamental problem with the data than this. Years ago, someone told about a man in New York who had heard that someone was hit by a car in Manhattan once every 20 minutes. And his response was, he must get awfully tired of that. Exactly the same reasoning can be found in these statistics that are given out, because they assume that these are the same people all the time. There have been several studies done, and fortunately they've been done by people who are left-wing intellectuals at the University of Michigan and conservative Republicans in Washington, and they all give the same answer, which is that in the course of less than a decade, most Americans move out of whatever income bracket they're in. For example, if you looked at the bottom 20% as of 1979 of income taxpayers, by 1988, 85% of those people were no longer in the bottom. In fact, a slightly higher percentage were in the top 20% by 1988 than remained in the bottom 20%. And so we're talking about a changing mixture of people over time rather than the same folks. In fact, many of the people in the bottom 20% are the children of the people in the top 20%. And finally, let me look at another crisis that we hear of, hunger statistics. Now, a political advocacy group computed a few years ago how many Americans were hungry. Now, when you think about it, how would you find out how many people are hungry? It takes a long time to go through a country of 240 million people and ask everybody, are you hungry? Naturally, they had to speed this up. So they got a census computer tape. And they figured out the eligibility for food stamps, and they ran the tape through to find out how many people are eligible for food stamps. Then they found out how many people actually get food stamps. They subtracted one from the other, and the difference were hungry. Using this method, someone decided to find out what was the hungriest county in the United States. It turned out to be a farming and ranching community where the employees and the employers ate what they grew. Now, because the employees were being paid partly in room and board, their cash payments were lower than they would have been otherwise. And so in the county, there were a certain number of people who were below the level where they were eligible for food, even though they were eating their own steaks and vegetables. And I think there was only one person in the entire county who actually was on food stamps. All the others were hungry.